исламское государство нацеливается на господство в исламском мире. И не только там. Только этими планами явно не ограничиваются.
Now, Russia's plan to fight against ISIL in Syria was raised during the meeting of Russia's president with his American counterpart this week. No specific arrangements were revealed, but both countries acknowledge they have common grounds in the battle against terrorists.
I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document R/2015/678, a letter dated the 1st of September 2015 from the permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. And now I give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Ban Ki-moon.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. S.Lavros, President of the Security Council and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russian Federation, distinguished Council members, distinguished ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, we just heard a short while ago Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov talking at the UN Security Council meeting in New York City. We'll be bringing you more on this throughout the program, so do stay with us. And earlier we talked to our correspondent, Igor Piskunov, who is in New York for us. So, of course, we'll be crossing back to him for more updates and news from New York. In the meantime, Russia insists that Syrian settlement should involve all sides, including Assad. An idea that was initially met with opposition from the West. But now there's a growing number of voices suggesting it may not be such a bad idea.
You can't continue to double down on a strategy that's doomed to failure.
You need to have conversations with people, and you need to find the common ground.
Now, it's been more than a year since the U.S.-led coalition began bombing Islamic State targets in Syria, but the airstrikes have had little effect. The terrorist group has been gradually expanding its grip on Syrian territory over the past 12 months. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Pentagon was left red-faced as it admitted only 4 or 5 U.S.-trained rebels remain on the ground fighting Islamic State in Syria.
That's what the total number of trained fighters remains.
It's a small number, and the ones that are in the fight is we're talking 4 or 5. So.
Is it still the goal to have about 12,000 of them there? Is that still the goal? What's the expectation then for them?
At the pace we're going, we won't reach the goal that we had initially established for ourselves. But the overall goal is to make sure that we have enough mass to be able to get work done on the ground.
And meanwhile, the Pentagon says the latest batch of so-called moderate Syrian rebels it trained and armed have handed their equipment over to an al-Qaeda-linked group. The U.S. vetted militants gave the al-Nusra Front 6 pickup trucks and ammunition. The hardware accounted for 1/4 of what the Pentagon supplied. What's more, just days earlier, up to 70 of the U.S. trainees reportedly defected to the extremists, along with more weapons provided by America. RT's Washington correspondent Ganesh Chakan grilled the Department of State over the failure.
We have made significant gains. I can quote back to you all of the stats that others have given over the last couple of weeks as we reach this 1-year anniversary in this struggle. But overall, I think we have seen gains on the ground.
You mentioned gains. Well, since the beginning of bombings last year, ISIL grew in territory. In front of me, I have the map of the territory that they control from September of last year and from this September, and it is considerably bigger. I can show you that. The number of fighters, as I understand, stayed about the same. Does that sound like a result of a Does it sound like gains? Does it sound like a result of a winning strategy?
Again, we've seen, certainly in Iraq, you've seen ISIL lose ground at Mosul Dam, Tikrit, other places. They've been pushed back from areas around Kirkuk and Erbil.
Well, in his response, the State Department spokesman did not really dispute the fact that overall ISIL gained more territory over this past year. What he also did not dispute was the fact that the Pentagon's training and arming of the Syrian rebels has failed so far. A Pentagon official was testifying in Congress saying that there are now, quote unquote, 4 or 5 U.S.-trained Syrian rebels on the battlefield to take on the Islamic State. 4 or 5. Here's what the State Department said about that.
The Department of Defense has been very candid in pointing out that this train and equip program for the moderate Syrian opposition has not, frankly, lived up to what we initially thought.
When you say that this train and equip program hasn't lived up to expectations, that's an understatement, isn't it? I mean, when you first said you didn't challenge the assessment, are you talking about the assessment of Senator Ayat, who said that that's a joke? Or are you?
No, the total numbers of those trained for the program.
Well, going back to the overall U.S. strategy in the fight against ISIL, I asked this.
Well, even U.S. officials say airstrikes alone are not going to do it. And about the U.S.-trained force, well, how winning is that force if it's just not enough of them?
Well, again, we're working and across a broad spectrum. Matt brought that up. Talking about the moderate Syrian opposition forces that we're training. That train and equip program. Let me finish. My train and equip program has fallen short. The Pentagon has admitted that.
Well, the question that Russia is asking, what is more important for the U.S. to defeat ISIL or not to deal with Assad? What the U.S. appears to be saying is that it wouldn't mind Russia fighting ISIL, but only if it doesn't help Assad. That becomes tricky, considering it is part of Russia's strategy to include the Syrian army in the fight.
And now let's go back to the UN Security Council meeting in New York, where Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is speaking.
Over this period, the situation has deteriorated further. The accumulation of the crisis potential has reached the point where one can refer to the destruction of the political map of the region which was formed in those days. Today, one can claim quite clearly that attempts to deal in an isolated way without linking it to the historic overall context of individual conflicts enjoys no prospects. In the past, we have dealt like this with Iraq, Libya, Yemen, then Lebanon, Syria, every time trying to convince one another that we're going to resolve this concrete problem and everything will be fine. And the decisions in most cases, or the solutions, were often sought in a change at any price of that or other regime, without caring about the consequences and without a comprehensive strategy, or even having a short-term vision for 2 to 3 steps forward. As a result of the euphoria which engulfed a great many following the Arab Spring, changed to horror, faced with the expansion of horror and violence and the shadow of religious wars looming over the region, as well as terrorist threats. Now, the dastardly actions of Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in the countries of the Arab Maghreb, the Yemeni branch of Al-Qaeda and other groups, of course, have faded in light of the actions of the Islamic States. On the border territories of Iraq and Syria, ISIL factically creating an extremist quasi-state which possesses a large repressive potential with stable sources of income, a well-equipped army, and elements of weapons of mass destruction. ISIL cells are flourishing in Libya, in Afghanistan, in other countries, and they're claiming that their plans include capturing Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, and spreading their evil activities to Europe, to Central and Southern Eastern Asia, and Russia. Terrorists are carrying out mass killings and public executions. They're threatening the very existence of various ethno-religious groups, including Christians, Kurds, and Alawites. Now, the Islamic State has an active professional propaganda machine, active in tens of languages. Today, when the merciless expansion of terrorists, which is leading to an uncontrolled wave of population movement to Europe, it has been recognized that the harm has been caused and that there is a need for joint action. We noted that during the recent informal summit of the EU Council in Luxembourg, as well as at the Prague summit of the Visegrad Group, it was clearly recognized that the migration crisis cannot be tackled without removing its root causes. In other words, without creating a solid bulwark on the path of the Islamic State and its desire to subjugate the region with the laws dating back to the Middle Ages. One should not stop the refugees, but the terrorists and the conflicts and wars that they give rise to. The Russians' assessment of the situation were clearly spelled out in the statement of President Putin during the summit of the General Assembly on the 28th of September. We're not attempting here to drive the discussion into a prospectless direction of determining who is right, who is guilty, but without learning the lessons of the reckless actions of the last 10 to 12 years, we will not be successful. The main lesson is that any unilateral actions are mortally dangerous. What we require are collective, agreed approaches backed by decisions of the Security Council. We believe that one needs to start with a clear and unambiguous determination of priorities. And here, as we see it, there is a clear understanding that the main threat is terrorist aggression, embodied as it is in the actions of ISIL. In our view, this should be followed by consistent practical steps in three key linked directions. Firstly, there is a need to unite and coordinate the efforts of those who can make a real contribution to combating terrorism. The armed forces of Syria, of Iraq, the Kurdish formations, the armed ranks of the patriotic Syrian opposition. In one word, all of those who are standing up against ISIL on the ground, as well as outside players who in one or other form can back the counter-terrorist activities in the region. It is of fundamental importance that such coordination should be based on decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the UN Charter. In planning joint actions in combating ISIL, one could utilize the potential of such a charter body as the Military Staff Committee. This is just the case when one requires the military expertise of the permanent members of the Security Council for a maximally effective forging and build-up of counter-terrorist work in the region. Secondly, there is a need to step up the progress of the intra-Syrian dialogue on the basis of the Geneva communique dated 30th July 2012. We back the relevant efforts of the SRSG, Stefan de Mistura, and make our contribution to launching the political process in which one should bring together representatives of the whole spectrum, the whole gamut of Syrian opposition forces and the government of Syrian Republic. Thirdly, there is a need to have an inclusive and balanced outside assistance for the political process with the participation of Russia, United States of America, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, the UAE, Jordan, and Qatar. We believe that a useful role must be played here by the European Union. The involvement of China would also enhance chances of success. We believe that such a composition of outside sponsors acting in a united way are in a position to assist Syrians in reaching agreement based on common objectives to prevent the creation of an extremist caliphate and strengthening the Syrian state on the basis of national reconciliation and understanding. Speaking at the rostrum of the General Assembly, President Putin proposed to discuss a possibility of discussing a resolution of the Security Council on coordinating all forces which wish to stand up against Islamic State and other terrorist structures. Today, we will present to the members of the Security Council a draft resolution. It is based on earlier adopted documents by the Council, based on building up joint counter-terrorist activities on the basis of the norms of international law. At the same time, we expect constructive discussion, comprehensive discussion on this topic during the next month. At the same time, mindful of the growth of the threat posed by ISIL, there is a need now to forge practical cooperation on the activities of all forces which are countering terrorism. On the 30th of September, in response to a letter by the President of Syria, the President of Russia asked and received the consent of the Council of Federation for the use of the armed forces of the Russian Federation in the Syrian Arab Republic. We're referring here exclusively to operation of the Russian Air Force to carry out strikes against ISIL positions in Syria. We have informed the authorities of the United States and other members of the coalition created by the Americans of this and are ready to forge standing channels of communication to ensure maximally effective fight against the terrorist groups. The most important task here is to counter the financing of terrorism. The terrorists strive to diversify their sources of funds is of alarm. Amongst the main elements is the illicit trafficking in oil and other mineral resources, the illicit trafficking in narcotics and weapons and cultural artifacts, and of course voluntary contributions of those who back them. In this respect, we call for a more stringent implementation of the requirements of Resolution 2199 regarding the drawing up of a sanctions list of physical and individuals who are trading with the Islamic State. There is a need to enhance the effectiveness of the expert group of the Anti-Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee in a systemic way, using the potential of the group, of the FATF and related regional structures. We propose also to make states accountable for their implementation of Resolution 2199 in a regular and systematic way. We believe that there is a need to include the Islamic State as a separate entity on the anti-terrorist sanctions list of the Security Council. Any delay in resolving this clearly pressing issue, of course, would be counterproductive from the point of view of the effectiveness of counter-terrorist efforts of the United Nations. We call to, in a more active way, counter the threats which stem from foreign terrorist fighters. There is a need to rapidly form a single database which contains information on them and to elaborate an additional mechanism for the exchange of information on their movements and also a simplified procedure for the extradition. Of especial importance is preventive work. First and foremost, fighting against the fueling of terrorism in accordance with Resolution 1624, which was adopted 10 years ago. Over this time, the pressing nature of countering terrorist ideology, of course, has increased substantially. The multi-ethnic and multi-religious aspect of Russia means that we have a unique experience.
Used the country's air force in Syria, with Islamic State named by Moscow as a threat to its national interests. And the Russian move has been welcomed by the Syrian government. Moscow was earlier asked by Damascus for more help in the fight against terrorists. Western governments have started changing their minds over the role and the future of President Assad and his government in Syria. So we could be looking at a big change in ultimately Western strategy on Syria.
Assad needs to go.
Assad has to go.
Assad cannot be a credible partner for us.
It is time for him to go.
He definitely has to be part of the negotiations.
Political resolution can only come about through a negotiation.
We have to acknowledge this is a total failure.
Let's not kid ourselves, that's a joke.
Our coalition is on the offensive. ISIL is on the defensive, and ISIL is going to lose.
More than 50 aircraft are taking part in Russia's mission in Syria. Over 20 flights were conducted both yesterday and during the night, destroying Islamic State headquarters, command centres and ammunition depots. All the strikes were coordinated in conjunction with Syrian army intelligence, Russian satellites, as well as drone footage as well. The airstrikes are being carried out strictly in areas where there are no civilians.